Hello, and thanks for joining the next video in the Watercolor for Real Beginners series. I'm Michelle Crawford, and today we're going to be learning about wet on wet and wet on dry watercolor techniques. If you haven't been following along, make sure to check out the other videos in this series, plus hit subscribe now so you can get notified for future content. Let's get started by going through our supplies. Today I've got my B watercolor paper, my Winsor & Newton Cotman Watercolor Series paints, and my Craftimo brushes, which I've been using throughout the series. Previously I had my bamboo Craftimo brushes, but today I'm actually using the new set that I picked up from Craftimo by Liesel's Artistic Studio. I also have a paint palette and a spray bottle to wet down my paints. First things first, let's go ahead and divide our paper into 8 sections. I'm just going to divide up the middle. On the left will be our wet on dry examples, and on the right will be our wet on wet. So you can go ahead and label it now. And then we'll also divide each side into 4 sections because we'll be doing 4 different examples of each. Now let's mix up some watercolor paints. You really only need 2 colors for this exercise, so I'm going to use my Permanent Rose and my Ultramarine. Make sure to keep a clean side and a dirty side of your water jars so that we can use clean water in some of our examples. First, for the wet on dry, we're going to see what happens when we apply wet paint to dry paper. So we're just going to make a rectangle shape here. You can see in the wet and dry example that the paint does not go around the boundary of where we've placed it, and we're getting a nice flat wash. Let's see what happens when we apply wet paint to wet paper. So we're going to take some clean water on our watercolor brush and just wet that section on the right. You don't want it overly wet, but you want to make sure your paper is nice and saturated. Now grab your blue paint and do the same thing. And observe what happens. You notice the paint is definitely flowing beyond where we've placed it on the paper because the underlying paper is also wet. And so the paint will always flow where there is wetness. And so you also notice that the flat wash is now kind of dissipating a little bit. And so if you're wanting to get a nice crisp edge and some detail, you want to use your wet on dry. If you want to get a more fuzzy or more blended background or object, then you want to use the wet on wet method. Okay, for our next method, let's see what happens when we apply wet paint to dry paint or wet paint to wet paint. To start, we'll do our rectangle here, and then we'll want to dry this before we move on to the next step. I'm going to fast forward by using my heat tool to dry this. Otherwise, you can just pause and wait for yours to dry. My paint is now dry, so I'll take my pink paint here, again my Permanent Rose, and I'm just going to paint a circle right in the middle of this square. Although the paint can move around in the area where we've placed it, it's not going to go beyond the edge of the wetness. So the paint below is dry and it's not going to move. This is really important when you're trying to do details at the end of a painting and you want to make sure that those are nice and crisp. Make sure that the paint underneath is very dry. Now let's do the same example, but we won't wait for the blue paint to dry. Go ahead and make our rectangle. Just as we did before. But now, before that's dry, let's go in with our pink paint and see what happens when we make our circle. You can see very quickly that the paint is not staying where I've placed it. We're getting a lot of movement and blending and kind of a color bleed here. And so this is really great for when you're trying to do maybe some abstract backgrounds, or you want to have something blurry in the background of your painting, or so you're going to get these soft edges and a blended effect versus crisp edges on top of this over here. So if you're looking for nice soft edges, make sure that you're applying wet paint onto wet paint. In our next example, we're going to layer some colors for our wet on dry, just make 3 horizontal lines with your blue paint or whichever color you're using today. And again, we want that to dry before we move on. So I'll use my heat tool. Now that this is dry, let's get our pink paint. And we're going to do the same thing with 3 horizontal lines right over top. And what do you notice here? Again, the paint has not moved from where, or is not moving beyond where we've placed it. But with this technique, you'll notice that we're getting a glazing effect. Glazing is when you apply a wet watercolor on top of already dried watercolor. And although the colors aren't mixing and blending and moving together, you do see a little bit of a color mix effect when you layer them on top. And that's because watercolor is translucent. So if you're looking to do some layering, make sure that you're layering wet watercolor on dry watercolor. What happens if we do this same example, but we don't let that first color dry? Again, blue paint, 3 lines. Get these nice and wet so we get a good example. Now let's go right into our pink and do the same thing, 3 lines on top. And what do you notice is happening? Again, paint's not moving beyond the water that's been placed down on dry paper, but where the colors are touching, you notice that there are definitely getting some bleeds and blooms and blends that are happening. Again, this is not an easy way to control watercolor. If you're looking for kind of that more natural or uncontrolled effect, this is a way to go. It's a really neat effect, but you can see very clearly the differences between the colors mixing and blending together in the example on the right with our wet paint touching wet paint, and with the paint on top of dry paint on the left, where we're getting a glazing effect versus the colors mixing on the paper. For our last example, we'll see what happens when we put 2 shapes right next to each other. This is really helpful when, say, you're painting like a flower or something. You'll learn that you want to let some of your paint dry before you move on to sections next to it. So let's start by doing half of our rectangle here. And of course, we're going to dry this. Now that this is dry, again, let's go in with our pink. We're just going to finish the other side of the rectangle. You get a little bit of overlap, that's fine. You can see with the wet paint next to dry paint, you're still getting nice crisp edges, and we're not getting any color mixing happening. If you do happen to overlap, you'll see a little bit of a glaze, but depending on if you want that or not, you just be more or less careful with your brush. Now on the other side, let's do the same thing, but we're not going to wait for the blue paint to dry, of course, because this is wet and wet. And actually, this might be considered wet into wet because we're not necessarily going to paint on top of the wet. We're going to paint right next to it. But this will show you what happens when you put wet paint next to wet paint. We've got that left side of our rectangle, and then we're going to go to our pink, and we're just going to go right up next to it with that paint. And initially, we're going to see a much softer edge. And depending on how wet it is, you can definitely get more or less movement. But if you are looking to get maybe a blend with this type of technique, we'll show this just on the top portion. If you rinse your brush, dry it off a little bit, you can always take a very, very light pressure and kind of blend back and forth, and actually even blend your colors on the page right here. So just giving you an example here of how you can continue to move those colors around once they've been placed. But even though they're right next to each other, a very crisp edge here on the left on our wet on dry example, and a little bit of a blurred edge here on the wet on wet. So I hope that helped you better understand wet on dry versus wet on wet. And as we continue throughout the series, we'll be utilizing both methods throughout our paintings to get different effects as we go. So to put this into practice, in the next video, we are going to paint an abstract geometric painting and just try to practice some of these techniques. So stay tuned, and again, make sure you hit subscribe so you can get notified for that next video in our Watercolor for Real Beginners series. Thanks and happy painting!